Happy Sunday. It is October 20th. This is the week in review with some Q&A. I have my neuro coffee, so let's have at it. It was a pretty busy week. Came off the intensive, was tired, so I'm still a little bit in recovery mode actually. It takes a little bit out of you when you have to put out that much energy over time, but we'll make it work. We'll recover by Intensive IX, which is actually next month, so it's only a few weeks away, so I'm excited about that. Posted a bunch of stuff, so up on YouTube we got the Restoring Knee Flexion video, so if you haven't seen that, check it out. Got a bunch of stuff up on Instagram this week, so we're staying busy. Hopefully we'll get back on the shoe quest as well this coming week, so we'll talk a little bit more about some shoes, and so that'll be interesting as well. But we've got a bunch of great questions for the Q&A, so let me kind of dig into those a little bit, and like I said, we'll just have at it. Okay, so let's look at our first question. This is from Alex Pett. So Alex asked one of the world's longest questions, and it's got multiple parts here, so we'll try to attack this thing as best we can. So my question is, in your model, are the terms compressed and expanded used mutually exclusively to describe an individual's global strategy, or are they used in combination to describe strategies at different segments? My current thought is that normal strategies bias expansion or compression, and that compensatory strategies would show expansion and compression. Okay, so let's look at the two potential archetypes of strategy here. So we have the two extremes that we'll use as representations, and very rarely do you get the full extreme bias, but it helps us to have a representation. So at one end of the spectrum, we have somebody that is structurally biased towards a compressive exhalation strategy. At the other end of the spectrum, we have somebody that's biased towards the inhalation expansion strategy. And so from that perspective, we can say that somebody does have a global strategy, and this is a bias that's created by genetics. So this is a structural, unchangeable element of our behavior, where we are biased towards one primary global strategy. Upon that, we can superimpose compensatory strategies that will help us promote a greater exhalation or inhalation depending on what our needs are and in what context we're behaving. So if I have someone that is biased towards exhalation based on their genetics, they still need to be able to move, and so movement is enhanced by their ability to expand. And so under those circumstances, they may find a way to move that promotes segmental expansion, as we would say, or segmental external rotation, such as supination versus pronation would be an expansion strategy. At the other end of the spectrum, I might take somebody that's biased towards an inhalation strategy. They need to exhale to produce force, and so we may superimpose an element of compressive strategy upon those. So I think that your current thought process, Alex, is correct, where genetically we'll be biased in one direction or the other somewhere along this spectrum of expansion versus compression. But then we'll ultimately have to use some other strategy, whether it be within the normal framework of our genetics, or we'll superimpose a compensatory strategy on top of that to achieve some level of performance, with the understanding that when I use a compensatory strategy, I will have to give up something. So I will either have to give up force production, or I will have to give up some aspect of my movement capabilities to achieve the desired result. So hopefully that helps you clarify, but I think that your thought process is actually very, very correct, Alex, so well done. Our next question comes from Katie Sinclair, former attendee of the intensive and currently in the intensive group, on our large discussion group that they get to follow up with after they attend the intensive. So Katie says, could you discuss an ideal or non-compensatory foot position and its relationship to inhalation, exhalation in the current phases of gait, and how or if we can potentially change compensatory foot mechanics with more proximal structures. So if we look at how the foot moves through the phases of gait, what we'll see is when the foot is off the ground, we're going to most likely be in our expansive strategy. So it's in an inhaled ER position. So as we talk about the foot, before the foot hits the ground, it's going to be in a relatively supinated position as it strikes the ground and begins its propulsive phase. The earliest of early propulsion, it will land in supination, and then it will move towards a pronated position. So the pronated position is the propulsive foot. And so this allows us to resist the forces of load, which is gravity, internal forces, external forces. If we didn't do this, we would stay in this inhaled position, and while we still may be able to achieve the desired result, our propulsive phase would be somewhat less than what might be ideal for us to overcome those forces. So if we didn't achieve a position of pronation and propulsion, we would either collapse under the forces that we're exposed to, or if, for instance, the ground would give way, we would fall into a hole. That would be the inability to propel as an extreme. So as we move through the gait cycle, we'll move through greater and greater propulsive phases. The maximum propulsion is going to occur when the medial heel comes back off the ground, and then we would move towards our more inhaled supinated strategy. So we land in supination, we move through pronation, which is our propulsive phase, and then we end again with supination. So that would be normal. And then the second part of her question is, where can we potentially change the compensatory foot mechanics with more proximal structures? Absolutely. So if I am biased towards an exhalation strategy in my axial skeleton, I might be more prone to emphasize my propulsive strategy. So that would be somebody that overemphasizes or stays in a position of pronation for an extended period of time during gait or any other propulsive activity. But if I can restore an element of inhalation or expansive strategy up the chain, so somewhere in the axial skeleton, such as the pelvis, I can promote a change in foot position, because they do go together. And then there's no guarantee of that. And under circumstances where I can't, then maybe this is where we need to do something that influences the sensation of the foot. So maybe this is a shoe choice, or this is an orthotic, or again, we can reinforce this through exercise selection just by position. So again, we're going back to the bias of using the mechanics above the foot to reorient the foot position from its compensatory position. So it definitely can influence the foot position through the proximal structures. The question then becomes is, does this person have the capability to do that? Or do they have perhaps a structural influence that does not allow that to occur anymore? And in that case, again, we might have to add something to the system from an orthotic standpoint. So to wrap that question up, Katie, yes, you can influence with proximal mechanics, but you better know what position that you're in before you start, so you can make sure that you're influencing that appropriately. All right, so our next couple questions come from Keith Wiggins. Let me break these up a little bit. Is there a good resource for the layperson on what synovial fluid is and how the body utilizes it? Yes. Keith, what I would suggest that you do, though, is let's make this really, really simple. Just start with a Google search and start looking at some resources in that respect that will allow you to find something that is at your level of understanding. Since I don't know you personally, I don't know what your current level of understanding is. Let's just start there. Find something that's meaningful to you, and then slowly gain more technical understanding of that. And then you can start to dig into more of the research and the scientific literature. But just find something that gives you a simple explanation as to how that fluid evolves and then how it behaves within the synovial joint. Second part, great video on knee flexion. Just wondering how my body could make such a mistake on where to store the fluid that would cause such discomfort. Well, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily look at it as a mistake per se. While we do make motor errors in regards to some movements, I wouldn't necessarily say that you're storing synovial fluid in an area that's a mistake. What I would say, though, is that you're probably using some form of movement-based strategy that results in a positioning of the fluid such that it provides an element of success for whatever your body is trying to achieve. So for instance, if it's a breathing-driven compensatory strategy, then that fluid is actually going to serve a purpose by allowing you to maintain an element of your breathing that supports every cellular process in your body. Or you behave in such a way that there's a certain movement strategy that is useful to allow you to accomplish a task, and this is merely the most common strategy that you use over time. Now, it can become problematic if you can't change the strategy enough, and then you start to produce load and stress and tension on certain structures, and then you might experience that as pain, of course, or a limitation in movement. But it's not necessarily a mistake. Usually what I would estimate is that the movement system is merely using it as a strategy to help it achieve some desired goal. If it becomes a limiting factor, if it becomes a problem from a pain or just a movement-based goal, then what I would say is that then you need to do something about it and to restore the normal mechanics. And so again, that's why I did that video in regards to restoring the flexion, so people do have an understanding that all you're doing is just pushing the fluids around. We can have a neurophysiological answer for these things, certainly, but on its simplest level, we're just pushing water around, and the video gives you an example of one way to do that. There are many ways that you can do that. If you're a dry needler, you can dry needle your way through that one. If you're just a strength coach, then there's ways for you to influence your exercise selection to achieve the same result. But that's one of the reasons why, like I said, that I did that video, so you can understand that all we're just talking about is the hydrostatic, hydrodynamics of movement and how we can influence that manually. So thank you, Keith. Okay, our next question comes from Saw Everything. Always interesting questions. Not sure I'm going to be able to provide a great answer on this next one, but we'll give it a shot. Thoughts on psychedelics laying new roadmaps for altering neurotransmitters most commonly taken routes, similarly allowing us to alter our relationship with gravity and atmospheric pressure to reinstate a preferred posture. I don't know. I don't spend much time thinking about psychedelics. I know that they've started utilizing them to treat disorders like post-traumatic stress and such. And so there probably is a lot of influence on the neurotransmitters. If you can alter the communication between, say, the prefrontal cortex and some of the more primitive aspects of the brain that may prevent us from being able to access movement and position, then maybe we do have something. I spend zero time thinking about it. I do appreciate the question because it is interesting to think about, just from a thought experiment standpoint, but I don't know if I can give you a great answer for that. If you do some of your own experimentation, that's entirely up to you, but not really something that I spend a whole lot of time on. So I apologize if I am insufficient in my answer, but I'm not really sure where to go with that. From Family Strong Fit. I get this question a lot. I must be new here. Who or what are the 16%? Please and thank you. So the philosophical answer to this is the 16% are the people that I am talking to. If you're questioning whether you're part of the 16%, I would say that if anything that I offer you is meaningful, then you probably are. If you're finding disinterest in anything that I'm offering, then you probably are not part of the 16%. But there will be a percentage of the population that will find what I'm offering meaningful, and that's who I'm talking to. And so that would be the 16%. Nothing more, nothing less. Anything that I would offer beyond that probably wouldn't be meaningful to you because it would be from my perspective and my philosophy. So hopefully that's a sufficient answer for you. If you enjoy the content, then please hang around and share it with others. And if you don't, then that's okay too. You're not going to hurt my feelings at all. So hopefully you enjoy it. So next question comes from Adam Estrin. Adam's asking about barefoot training. So thoughts on training barefoot and when, if, and how it would be practical. So the question here is what sensation are we trying to promote during training? And are we going to accomplish the movement-based task that's associated with it? So if I am wearing a shoe that prevents me from sensing something, then it may behoove me to take them out of the shoe to allow them to feel. So let me give you a for instance. So I'm gonna pick on a shoe brand. So Nike shoes tend to have this really extreme heel to toe ratio, which may actually prevent me from achieving a sufficient propulsive phase during some form of activity. And so what I might want to do is take them out of the shoe temporarily to allow them to get a sense of that position. So my propulsive phase becomes very, very strong when the medial calcaneus is on the ground. So I may have to take them out of the shoe because if I have a very significant heel to toe ratio, the foot will be biased towards supination, and that would prevent the medial calcaneus from coming down to the ground. So in that case, take them out of the shoe, perform some form of activity where they can capture that heel sensation, and then I have a frame of reference, or as we would say, a movement vocabulary in regards to what we're trying to achieve. Then maybe I can put them back into that shoe, and then that would allow them to carry over that sensation to an activity in a shoe. I don't think there's anything special about dissipation of forces, because when you look at the research, I think a lot of people got carried away with the barefoot thing because of a couple of resources that were promoted very, very heavily that appeared to have this significant amount of research. But I can assure you with great confidence that there are just as many primitive cultures that use a rear foot strike as a forefoot strike. The literature is out there, so there's really nothing that is representative of how you would behave in a barefoot versus a shoe. It's just a matter of the sensation, what you're trying to accomplish, and does the shoe interfere with that. So I'll give you another for instance, and we'll expand on this in another video. But you look at the reasoning behind why powerlifters sort of gravitate towards these flatter shoes like a Chuck Taylor, because powerlifters behave in a propulsive phase at all times. In fact, it's rather extreme. And so what the Chuck Taylors allow them to do is maintain the medial heel contact because it's a very, very flat shoe. It's a very, very flat surface. And so it allows them to capture and maintain that propulsive strategy a little bit more effectively than, say, a heels elevated shoe, which would bias you towards more of an inhalation strategy, which would actually reduce your force production, although it may allow you to capture depth in a squat. But like I said, we'll expand on that later. So you take people out of shoes when you're trying to capture a sensation that the shoe prevents. You also may have to change your shoe selection. So one of the things that we're doing with the Shoe Quest videos is we're comparing shoes in regards to what we're asking people to do from an athletic standpoint. And what we find is that certain shoes support our behaviors in good ways, such as the Under Armour Tri-Base Thrive, that is our current bias towards our dynamic shoe. It has a very level heel. It allows you to feel the heel contact that we're going to need for change of direction activities, whereas some of the other shoes don't support that element. And so again, this is a shoe that allows us to feel that sensory contact, so we don't have to take people out of their shoes necessarily. But if you are wearing a shoe that does, then now you can bias them towards barefoot. If you want to do things like warm your athletes up in bare feet before they put their shoes back on, I don't think there's any issues with that, as long as you understand why you're trying to do that, because you're trying to provide them with some form of sensory input that is beneficial to their performance. And if not, then you don't worry too much about it. All right, our next question comes from Copalope, and this is, I looked her up because I wanted to know what her name was, and so it's actually Rachel. Rachel, I have a little bit of concern that every picture that you take on your Instagram account has a right cervical side bend, so I'm hoping it's not a mechanical issue there. I hope it's just your signature pose, so well done. So Rachel asks, what books or publications would you recommend that would aid in a deeper understanding of disordered breathing patterns, rib cage compensatory strategies, and their effects on distal mechanics? So I do have a couple recommendations that you could go with. And so this is Chai Tao's breathing book. So that's a nice little book in regards to some of the respiratory mechanics and influences there. I would also recommend Diane Lee's book on the thorax. The first half of the book is entirely about thorax mechanics, and she does a really great job of breaking down the research. You can actually I believe you can download a paper from her that also does a brief review of those same mechanics to a certain degree. But the book is really good as far as breaking it down. You're going to have to look at things in regards to breathing. However, there are elements of that in there. But I think if you use the Chai Tao book and then sort of reinforce those concepts as you read Diane Lee's book, then I think you've got a nice double whammy there in regards to those mechanics. But you're going to have to look at things from a compensatory strategy versus a norm, and that's a little bit more difficult. But if you kind of follow along with some of the stuff that we're doing here from a content standpoint, then maybe we can help you with that. And as you read through these, obviously just ask more questions. So you go to askbillhartman@gmail, and you throw me some questions that way, and maybe we can answer those as well. The second part of Rachel's question is she's also looking for books on gait mechanics and how it relates to early and late propulsion. And what I would say is early and late propulsion are terms that I utilize for my understanding, to understand the elements of how we're behaving against gravity. So I don't know that you're going to find anything that's supportive of that to a great degree, but I would say that you start with Michaud's Human Locomotion book. There's a lot of really good information in there that'll start to break down some of the gait mechanics for you. So that's a nice little book to start with. But I would say that maybe you just follow along with some of the content that I'm putting out that will be somewhat helpful for you to understand. And again, as you read through these resources, just simply formulate some questions and then send them to me at askbillhartman@gmail, or post them up on the Instagram for the weekly reviews, and we can break those out for you. All right. We are rolling. So this is from Kevin Steen, my boy, Kevin Steen. Would you give your thoughts on strategies to improve front rack position for front squats or cleans as it relates to ER and IR? My thinking is that position requires maximum ER at the shoulder in a range bias towards IR. Do you think it would be more effective to train this position specifically or utilize shoulder above and shoulder below? He's talking about keeping the shoulder in an inhaled position where you would be more biased towards ER to begin with and then drive it from there. So first and foremost, just do the rack position first and just to see what the response is. Maybe you have to do nothing to achieve what your goal is in regards to being able to perform a squat or catching a clean. That's the easiest way to determine what you need to do. So if I'm incapable from the outset, and then maybe you do a couple of measures, so you look at overhead pressing position of the shoulder girdle in regards to the shoulder, the lower cervical spine and head position. That's going to give you an element of understanding as to what this person is capable of. And then perhaps then you do go chase a more inhaled strategy that you have to build the position from the bottom up. So for instance, I might need to capture more inhalation bias before I move towards that exhalation strategy where I would typically position the shoulder girdle for a front squat or a clean. And so you are correct that maybe I do have to build that external rotation element. So when I'm front squatting, to front squat effectively, to hold the rack position effectively, I must be biased towards external rotation, inhalation, before I can achieve that rack position, because you are moving towards an internally rotated position at the shoulder girdle at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, which is why that is the most common place for shoulder impingement and compressive strategies that can result in pain. So with Kevin, I think you're dead on. I think you know exactly what you are asking, and you know the answer to the question that you're asking before you even ask the question. So that's what I would do is just bias everything towards the inhalation prior to trying to attempt the front rack. Next question comes from Functional Muscle. Love the way you think, but it's also stuff I've never heard or even thought about before. What's the best place to learn from you? Products, courses, just keep listening. Thanks, Bill. Well, thank you, Functional Muscle. Sorry, I didn't look up your name, boss. So right now, what I would say is you just follow the content. You get on the mentorship list to make sure that you're getting the information first and foremost from ahead of everyone else, and then stay the course, because we're just going to start laying this stuff out for you, and then you keep asking specific questions. So as you're receiving some form of information, formulate a question, and ask me. Go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, and we can answer that question for you. Keep posting on Instagram as far as your questions for the weekly Q&A, and we build it out from there. And then I would say it's probably time for you to apply to an intensive. So the next intensive will be in early 2020, and that's intensive number 10, so it's a big deal. And so I would suggest that you apply there. We'll see what we lay out, but I would say stick to the content for now, and then keep asking questions. Last question comes from TS Training Systems. Bill, can you discuss the position of the spine when you're trying to bias movements towards IR or ER? If IR is associated with extension, adduction, pronation, and dorsiflexion, then should we be putting the spine into some extension as well? Or are we just trying to keep the cylinder stacked as IR and ER refer to just the limbs? It does not refer to just the limbs. So the IR and ER is part of the global strategy. So ER is an inhalation strategy. IR is an exhalation strategy. And so the way I would look at this is if we're performing a squat where the ischial tuberosities are over the heel as you sit down into a deep squat, that's going to be biased towards inhalation, external rotation. As we're performing a hinge movement like a deadlift or an RDL, that's going to be biased more towards the IR exhalation strategy. So right there, you have an element of influence merely by exercise selection versus trying to coach the spine into a position. So I would say that the best way for you to structure this, rather than trying to build some sort of nuance and trying to capture some ideal spine position, is use your exercise selection. So if I'm trying to bias towards an exhalation, internally rotated position, so those are your kettlebell swings, those are your RDLs, those are your deadlifts, so anything that would be considered in the hinging family, the way people categorize exercises would be your bias towards IR, and so the spine position would follow as appropriate to match the needs of that exercise. If I'm trying to bias towards ER, that's going to be more of your elements towards your squatting patterns, the more upright, the more expansive type of activities. And rather than, I'm not a big fan of trying to coach the spine into some magical ideal position, because the spine should be adaptable throughout. When the spine is not adaptable, that's when the problems tend to arise in regards to load, stress, tension, pressures, etc., that not only limit our movement capabilities, but can ultimately result in pain. So that's our questions for this week. I appreciate you guys paying attention. Check out the rest of the content up here on YouTube and on Instagram, and hopefully this is useful for you. I truly enjoy going through this stuff. If you have any other questions that arise from these answers, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com. Send me a question, ask for clarification. I'd be happy to do that. We'll throw those up during the week if we can. And again, just be looking for more content here and other places on social media. So have a great rest of your Sunday, and then have a great week coming up.